I'd like to begin today with an acknowledgement of country. I acknowledge that I'm hosting this event from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of Australia. So welcome everyone again, and thank you for joining us on your lunch break. My name is Liz Tierney, and I am the Marketing Coordinator at Recovery Partners. What an interesting and intense 18 months we've all had. This event is to empower you to adjust to life after lockdown. With Australia passing the 80% first dose mark and many states and territories having revealed their roadmaps out of lockdown, the timing of this event could hardly be better, if we do say so ourselves. But we know that a lot of people are feeling really nervous about restrictions ending. Maybe you're feeling anxious about what it means for returning to the workplace. Or maybe you're an employer who is concerned about protecting your staff and protecting your business, but you're not sure how you feel about mandating the vaccine, or even if you can. So our hope is that you leave today with the knowledge and understanding to adjust to life after lockdown, whatever that means and however that looks for you. So on to our speakers. Today, we'll be hearing from an impressive panel of speakers who bring a wealth of experience and knowledge to help us all navigate the new normal. A warm welcome to Bryony Benjamin, Chris Doyle, Athena Koelmeyer, and David Allan. I would like to thank them in advance for their time and contribution to this event. Without question, today is only made possible with their generosity. We're going to be conducting the event in two segments. So firstly, I will chat to Bryony about her experience and tips for resilience in tough times. I will then hand over to Alistair Grant from Recovery Partners, who will speak with Athena, Chris and David about COVID and the workplace.
So look, I guess from now we're looking into that sort of secondary stanza. So Bryony gave us a lot of insights as to looking at new paths and taking new directions. And for a lot of us, we've got a new normal that's ahead of us. We're coming out of lockdown. We may be wanting to return to work. We may not be wanting to return to work. So, I think it's looking at some of those things that Bryony shared with us and tapping into that steadfast resilience she shared with us in terms of some of the most challenging times that one could ever fathom. And the fact that we can all do this. So yeah, without question, COVID's been difficult and we don't want to not acknowledge that. But I think it's about looking at the positivities and, the notes that Liz has shared at the start, that we are moving in the right direction. Vaccination rates are going up, infection rates are going down. So it seems like we're getting a handle of what this new normal is. So look, I guess to help us understand that new normality, we have the privilege of having three really excellent speakers, three individuals that I've personally had the benefit of being in connection to either directly themselves or the companies that they represent. So really excited to hear from these guys, where with Chris, we're going to be talking about work health safety, workforce engagement strategies, and that's coming on behalf of his two hats that he wears as the Lendlease operator, and then also in the mentally healthy workforce engagement with the New South Wales government. Employment law, all other legalities will be covered by Athena Koelmeyer in her capacity as one of the managing directors there or leading partners there at Workplace Law. And then finally, workplace risk and insurance considerations will be shared with us by David Allan over at Willis Towers Watson. So all bring a really unique skill set and a different lens for us all to take in as we start to navigate that new direction. So at the end of the session as well, we'll create that opportunity, much like we did there with Bryony, for you to ask those questions, and we'll work as a bit of a panel to dissect some of the information and come back with a really round and full response, hopefully. So do ask your questions via the chat function as you have been doing, and we'll get into the second stanza. So we'll start off with Chris. Chris, do you want to take yourself off mute and get ready to go? So Chris joins us as the Group Head of EH&S at Lendlease, and he's an ambassador for the New South Wales Government's mentally healthy workplaces. Chris has been with Lendlease for the past 16 years where he spent time within construction project teams across 36 countries. That's massive. Many in response to a crisis or a serious issue. So Chris then became the founder of Build Safe in Dubai, an initiative in the Middle East, which was formed to champion the rights and working conditions of the migrant construction labour force in the Middle East. Chris has since then been appointed to the New South Wales government's working group in 2020 as one of the 12 New South Wales mentally healthy workplace ambassadors, promoting psychologically safe workplaces for both white collar and blue collar workforces. Anyone that's had the chance to link to the Lendlease story would understand that that is something they do incredibly well. As an organisation, I really do put you guys at the top of the pedestal, Chris. So well done for all your work there, and looking forward to hearing from you today.
Great. Thank you, and thanks for the introduction, and also thanks to Brian. I think that's was an amazing presentation. Definitely a hard act to follow, and I'm sure the other speakers feel the same. So me, you've heard the introduction. I call myself a generalist. I think my specialty is probably asking questions and listening. And else to mention that I have been to Lendlease projects across 36 countries in my time with Lendlease, which seems a bit silly because we've rationalised the business in recent years. We're only in 10. But I was the person they probably least wanted to see, but hopefully by the time I left, they were glad I came, because I was the person who jumped on a plane when there was fatality. I was the person who went on a plane in a crisis after a natural disaster, after major problems on our projects, and would try and help steer them out of the challenge. So you do get to see people at their most vulnerable. And normally I'd say to people, one particular question is, if we were back at the start of this project, what would we do different? And you never get silence. You often get people giving quite an impassioned answer around the partners we picked, or the leadership that were involved with the project, or the working conditions, or the things that we said yes to that we shouldn't have. And so through that, in our own organisation, we've moved on to a lot of learning around sort of the physical side of safety, and I'll get onto the psychological side of safety. So at Lendlease, we worked out that a project that's under time pressure, 4 times more likely to have a major incident occur, and it's not rocket science when you think of it, but we've been able to link the data. And as we come out of lockdown, if you look at a lot of our blue collar work in particular, and what we do around construction, they're trying to make up for lost time. So the pressures of hours lost during COVID, only maybe having 25-50% of workers on site, their clients, our clients, maybe us as a client, they're trying to ramp things up now as we come back out of lockdown and get back to 100% of people on site. So the people who have been literally carrying the load all the way through the last 20 months, which has mostly been the blue collar workforce, no time for a clap and a pat on the back, because we're about to ramp things up. And I think that's some of the challenges we're about to see. On the New South Wales mentally health, the workplaces front, so I feel very fortunate because, equally inspiring people like Bryony on this committee of 12. We've got people like John Brogden, the former opposition leader, who's also CEO of Landcom and the chairman of Lifeline, and Fiona Simpson, who in the news yesterday is president of National Farmers Federation. These people bring in their own personal, unique stories, plus the whole sectors that they work in, and bringing to the table. And we start to realise that mentally healthy workplaces is an enormous issue that is whole of government and whole of industry that we're seeing, particularly just in our focus area of New South Wales. And so some of the learnings that I guess I've taken from listening to people and learning from others is that as a workplace, there's 2 things around mental health that stand them in good stead, because if you look at the challenges around you, it's really overwhelming as an employer, as an organisation, to go, where do I start? What are the principles? Are we going to sort of try and boil the ocean in our response to both our employees and society's needs around, what's potentially another growing epidemic around mental health? So the 2 things are, firstly, is it a place of connection? Because there are so many things about your workforce or the workers in your organisation that you have no control over. You don't know what pre-existing medical conditions they're bringing. You don't know what's going on in their home and family life. You don't know what's going on with their relationships. You're not sure what's going on with their own children. And I speak to this affectionately because I literally had a physical breakdown 4 years ago, by not dealing with some work issues and then having a family crisis, which was all consuming 20 hours a day for 3 months on end, to the point where my body just said no more. I blacked out. I woke up in a hospital 4 hours later. Took a long time to recover and get back to normal. And this is from your typical sort of middle-aged white male who just says, I'm all right, I can do this. I was born to do this. I can just carry on. And I'm still not the only one out there. There are literally thousands and millions of people out here with this same attitude who didn't take the time to either speak, to get help, and was offering themselves as the help to other people, but not actually looking after themselves. So I'm quite passionate about organisations being connectors when people bring challenges into the workplace. So whether that's being a mental health first aider, whether that's offering EAP program, or whether that's linking in with existing resources like, we connect with New South Wales government, they're the type of things that an organisation can do. Then there's the tricky bit. First bit's the easy bit. Are you a place of fairness? So the first thing is place of connection. Second one, place of fairness. And if you look into the data, we'll see that, there's still a lot of stress and anxiety that the workplace is either the cause of or adding to what people bring into the workplace. So things around bullying, harassment, the way that people get spoken down to, the way that sometimes connections are discouraged in particular workplaces, even down to the culture and the gossip and things that go on in organisations. It's clear and it's being put into the data. So what I did, and I've got one slide here that I'll share, so we can just get it put onto the data slide. The New South Wales government recently introduced some of their data from CIRA, which a lot of you may know, which is the State Insurance Regulatory Agency, and they looked at psychosocial data and then the physical claims data across a 5-year period. And so we don't have the FY20 and FY21 data more broadly available, but this gives us a really interesting snapshot as to where things in New South Wales were going from a claims perspective in the 5 years pre-pandemic. And so no surprise that there was a 53% increase in psychosocial injury claims across that 5-year period, 26,000 workers or more than that who needed time off work. And perhaps even more staggering is if we look at the world of sort of physical health and safety, which you may be familiar with, the return to work after physical injury. The average days per claim was 44. For psychosocial, 175. The average cost of a claim for physical injury, 21,000. Psychosocial, 85,000. We are working with a 4-to-1 ratio, and where are all our efforts going at the moment? Unashamedly, it's in physical health and safety and preventing those things, and there's a whole reason for that. What we're seeing emerging is this complete change in where the insurance costs are coming from, and it doesn't discriminate. It's not just in the sectors that you might expect, which is in emergency services and police. We're seeing it across all sectors through education, health, construction, manufacturing, and even in the office space. So we're seeing this huge rise in the claims, and then you're still seeing that majorly overrepresented around harassment and workplace bullying, so these cultural issues. And so we do know that at the start of that journey, we're kind of 4,500 claims a year. Now we're up to, at sort of into FY20, it was looking like 7,500. And now we've had this 18, 20-month circuit breaker in a lot of our industries. So it's going to be really interesting to see where we move to and where we come out of this. And I guess as we come out of lockdown and we get into the vaccination rates, this is a great opportunity to see what happens next. And I'm not sure, Alistair, whether you want me to roll on or if there was a couple of questions that you had that you wanted me to answer.
Yeah, look, I'm happy to do it either way. I mean, there are a couple of questions that I'm happy to ping it to you if you think that will help. I think that data is incredible, and particularly that right-hand column that talks to stressors and, that being a 50% representation of where psychological injury is born from. And we are openly discussing on this conference today that we're all about to have a new level of stress enter into our lives. So perhaps if you're able to share some insights of what you've obtained during the pandemic thus far, and if you're able to share some thoughts on what do you see in the next few months playing out, and how can, people and the organisations there within, how can they best respond?
Yeah, So interestingly, and I think there are some insights from the physical data which we may see play out in the psychological data. So Lendlease has got 10,000 employees globally, but there's another 50,000 workers on any given day that we include in our data set. So we've got 100 million hours of working data a year across 10 countries to look at, and we've picked out some interesting trends. So in the first 6 months of the pandemic, our medical treatment injuries stayed static compared to pre-pandemic, but lost time injuries literally just almost disappeared. And then in the sort of more recent 6 months at the back end of FY21, again, the medical treatment rates were similar to pre-pandemic, yet we've had this massive spike in lost time injuries, yet the duration that was recorded was shorter. And so in going into each of our different geographies and trying to look into, well, what actually is this data telling us, we found a couple of things. If you recall the first 6 months of the pandemic where people didn't really know what was going to happen next, concerns around job security was high. The interviews that we had with a lot of people were saying that I had an injury, I probably should have taken time off. I was that worried about my job. If in the UK people were getting furloughed, which was stood down on 80% pay, I didn't want to be on the radar as someone who was dispensable because I'm injured. And I didn't want to put my head up from the parapet at all. So with that sort of heightened sense of insecurity around their future, people who were even getting injured at work weren't wanting to look for the time off. Now, if you put that to the back end of the pandemic, so the last 6 months of the previous financial year, we saw a spike in lost time injuries, yet the majority of them were 5 days or less. So it was almost like we're in this environment where people were feeling a little bit secure about their jobs, and particularly in the blue collar space, they were tired. They've been working through this pandemic without a break, while most of us got to work from home. And when the opportunity arose with their medical treatment to be signed off for 3 or 4 days, they were actually taking the opportunity to take some downtime and have some time off. So with that security came their feeling that they could actually take more off. Now, we're only just starting to get some glimpses of the SERA data around the psychological and the mental health claims, but we already noticed that at the back end of FY20, so that period where people weren't taking time off, we saw a huge drop off in claims in some of that period. So I think, as we're moving into situations where you'll read that, it's been 106 days since the gym had opened. For a lot of our people now, they're returning to the office for the first time, in closer to 600-700 days in some instances by the time they get back. We're now looking into what is it that people are looking for in that return to office. And so what we've seen is that easy desk booking systems, they're waiting for there to be no masks. They want to have connection with people. They actually weren't craving for physical offices. They want open plan, but with distance between them and the same people. People were happy not to be 5 days in the office in the future. So we're starting to get some of these insights that will play out in the next couple of months. But I think in our world, in New South Wales and Victoria, you'll probably notice February is probably going to be more of a turning point when it's sort of back to school, end of the summer holidays, and organisations will subtly start to push for more people to return to the office than we may see in the next 2 to 3 months.
Yeah, great. It's an interesting thing that's going to be playing out shortly. And that time, the 2021 seems to have evaporated in terms of time. It's like the hourglass, the sands have just slipped right through it. So it'll be interesting to see what that employer response is going forward. I wonder if you might be able to share some insights from, Lendlease being an international group and certain countries are well ahead of us, or they've taken different strategies in lockdown and restrictions. What insights could you potentially share with us and the wider audience as to what developed there and how that might inform your response here locally within Australia? If you'd have read, there's an article a couple of days ago in the Sydney Morning Herald from Bevan Shields, who's the Europe correspondent. And I think the title of the article was, thankfully there's a brave new post-vaccination world and it actually feels like the old. And there was a lot of good stuff in there, but it kind of described the icing on the cake of life, not the cake itself, because it did refer to a lot of things around, stadiums are full, concert halls being full, places without masks, places without QR codes, and having to sign in.
But what we've seen in our offices, and this is, in our London office, probably the main one, is that they are nowhere near full. We're not even at 50% capacity. So despite the freedom of movement and people to congregate and go places, we have not seen the return of the office. Now, London, even more so than Sydney, big commuter belt, so maybe the commute's putting it off, not 100% sure. But if I then jump over to our New York office, even lower rates of turnout, because people are just feeling that after all this time, I'm kind of used to being at home. We're not actually feeling the pressure to come back into the office, and the company's not fully urged me to go back yet. Now, if you go to a more local level, if you go back sort of 4 or 5 months where there was a reasonable level of freedom of movement, even on the eastern seaboard, in the Lendlease world, the office with the lowest turnout has been Brisbane. And so despite all of the sort of fortress, I guess, Queensland and the protection and the low COVID cases, to this day, our Brisbane office is the lowest turnout at Lendlease, and we're not the only one. So we've kind of got this puzzling thing where even where we've kind of ring-fenced and protected states, we've had low office turnouts. And so the Property Council of Australia had even said back in May, offices in Darwin and Hobart were over 90% occupancy compared to pre-pandemic. Nowhere else in Australia at any point has hit above 80%. So we're actually having these huge swathes of the workforce who have not only been limited contact to the office, but actually not been there at all for 20 months. And so there's this other thing that's been going on, which the pandemic's drawn out. So the Financial Times in the UK have recently come up with this sort of article around the quarter-life crisis amongst young workers. Harvard Business Review did a study where Microsoft put out a survey to young workers in a whole range of different markets who said, 41% are considering leaving their employers. Now, McKinsey have equally done a large survey, which includes sort of Australia and the UK, Canada, US, and Singapore. And the reason they put this survey out, because in the US, in between April and September this year, 15 million workers quit their jobs. 36% of them quit with no job to go to. And so we're now starting to see some really interesting insights coming on the back end of this pandemic. Now, these are generally things that are representing a progress in society. So there's a whole different understanding and awareness and acceptance around mental health and about psychosocial risk and about the workplace needing to be more acceptable and less threatening. That's a good thing. Workers have really reassessed their careers, and the data and the surveys is trying to point this out. And so this whole notion of, work to live, not live to work, is actually playing out. And so the survey that was done, in these different countries is actually pointing out that 40% of the respondents have said, I'm at least somewhat to actually interested in leaving my organisation next 3 to 6 months. So we are going to see a big turnover of people coming in the next 6 months as we come out of lockdown as well. And then the last thing before I kind of finish up my segment is to talk about is pre-pandemic, a lot of organisations, and we're one where it's very clear, there is a bit of a wedge between white collar and blue collar, and we do see it in Australia. That wedge and that divide has just got bigger, whether we realise it or not, in the last 20 months. So whether it's blue collar in transport or construction or manufacture or healthcare, they have got in their cars, on the buses, on the trains, and they've gone to work every day, and the rest of us have been able to work from home. Pre-pandemic, we would already get feedback that access to employee benefit programs, lunchtime yoga, you name it, that we offer in the workplace, it isn't available for our blue collar workers who are pouring concrete and driving and delivering materials around our major workforces. They've already sort of shared with me that I don't really have tolerance for the office people when they come back saying, oh, the days my boss wants me to come in don't suit me, or I want to come in the days where I can do lunchtime yoga, and I want to come in to the days. Now, all things from my perspective that are fair and reasonable, but we are splitting out this sort of blue and white collar economy even further in our organisations. And so if, like me, you've got a keen interest in social science, we're in for a incredible 12 months, and buckle up because it's going to be very interesting.
Oh, 100%. I think we've already seen elements of, Dickinson style things with Tale of Two Cities and the ring fencing. It will be challenging as we go forward. And I think it's great that you call that out. Look, there are some really good questions that have come through. Just for those, I have taken note of them. We will look to get to them. If not, Chris, I might be so bold as to ask whether we maybe get a written response to some of those to help sort of give that out as an FAQs.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful.
Yep.
Thank you. And thank you so much for your insights. Well researched, well delivered. That was excellent. Thank you, Chris. Next over is to Athena. So Athena is the Managing Director and Principal at Workplace Law, good friends of ours, and a great team over there. Athena and her team at Workplace Law, they provide expert advice for employers in all areas of workplace relations, employment law, industrial disputes, discrimination, and work health safety. So, you're enjoying the full matters that come across, whether they are areas of law, whether they're litigation, non-litigation. Athena has an unflappable sense of humour, which is true, and a pragmatic approach to guiding and supporting her clients. Dare say we might all need a little bit of a sense of humour in some of these days ahead. But Athena, I'll hand over to you because I'm really looking forward to the legalities and insights you can provide us there.
Thanks, Alistair. Maybe just commenting quickly on one of the things that Chris said. Before the Delta lockdowns that we've had, when everybody sort of got back to work after the sort of first non-Delta set of lockdowns, we have honestly never been busier than we were with people who had come back to the workplace, I think, unprepared for that re-entry into the workplace. And we spent so much time investigating allegations of bullying, allegations of sexual harassment. Maybe people were missing being able to touch each other in the tea room. I don't know. But it was absolutely crazy. So, when Chris says, heads up, this is going to be hard, I am absolutely with him because this is absolutely going to be hard. So I encourage you, and I guess the purpose of these slides, as you can see there from that title slide, please have a reopening plan. And I'm just going to skim through a couple of slides today. As you know, I'm a lawyer. I can't help but write slides. I know the recording's available. So if I whiz through too quickly, I'm sure you can go back and pause them later. So maybe if we just go to the next slide and we can talk about some happy stuff, which is that we have roadmaps, that we're well advanced with our roadmaps. This week, although Monday now seems like 1,000 years ago to me for some reason, but this week New South Wales has enjoyed its freedoms, which were promised by Gladys and implemented by the new Premier. In Victoria, I saw a headline this morning that says that you are well and truly on track for earlier than that date, which I'm sure will be a massive relief to my friends in Victoria, the most lockdown city in the world. And I think that's something that you should all get a badge for at the end of all of this, because that has, I don't know how all of you have done it, to be honest. So just moving on to the next one, I just want to talk to you for a moment because there's a lot of confusion. As I mentioned to Rowan recently from Recovery Partners, that there is, all I've talked to people about probably for the last 3 weeks, certainly with my New South Wales clients, has been about vaccination. And I know some of you are here today because you've texted me to say, I'm here to hear what you have to say about vaccination. So I just want to clarify one point before we all get very enthusiastic about vaccination, that vaccination actually means either having 2 doses of the COVID vaccine or having your medical contraindication certificate. And that's super important for disability discrimination reasons. And for employers, and some of my employers are very enthusiastic about rolling out their everybody has to be fully vaxxed policy. Just sort of note that in your considerations of whether or not you're requiring full vaccination. And some of you may not have control over that, but if you are an organisation that has control over whether or not you choose to implement a policy like that, just bear that in mind because that is super important. Just moving on to the next slide, we'll talk about getting employees back to work. And I'm just going to refer back to something Bryony said, which is that communication and a clear plan will reduce your employees' anxiety. And I think that is right. And certainly our experience, in the back to work period between lockdowns, I think bears that out, in that there was a lack of preparedness for people just to get thrown back into what they did before. So I guess question number one, and I know a lot of you are here today to hear about this: do employees need to be vaccinated in order to work? Do I need to check the vaccination status of my employees as a result? And training in whatever my organisation's COVID safety plan is, because you can't just sort of wave it around and expect people are going to get it. I think there needs to be, some pretty clear conversations and consultation around what your COVID safety plan is for now and for the future. So just moving on to the next slide, do my employees need to be fully vaccinated? I'm sure some of you here today already know that if you are working in an industry where there is a mandate that all employees be vaccinated, I'm talking to health workers, I'm talking to aged care workers, I'm talking to disability care now, somewhat belatedly, but disability care workers. As an employer, you don't have any choice there. The government has mandated that your employees must be vaccinated. They've given some timeframes in which that must be done. And as an employer, you must comply, because for sure you will be the ones on the hook if you are allowing people to work who are not mandatory when the law says when you are allowing people to work who are not vaccinated when the law says they must be. So please, I know that checking public health orders or any directives that might apply to your employees is very confusing, and nobody really likes it. And certainly I've had people call me while they're trying to navigate the New South Wales public health order webpage, getting very upset, but bear with it. So please check the public health orders or directives that apply to you. Retail in New South Wales had a very quick lesson in what they needed to do over the last couple of weeks to get your employees back to work. So, that is your best source of truth. Please don't Google, please don't look on Facebook, please don't, do any of the other random stuff that people seem to be doing. New South Wales and Victoria Public Health Orders website is the single source of truth that you should be paying attention to here. Just also on not all employees being required to return from the workplace or office, and certainly I'm there with what was mentioned earlier, that I think it's probably February next year, certainly for a lot of our white collar clients. This period, I think, is sort of, there's a bit of this, and it's a bit too hard for a lot of employers trying to navigate the 70% and then the 80%, and then what happens after that in terms of the free-for-all from, about December. So there's a lot of people, I think, who will be thinking about returning to work after Christmas close down next year, and that will be a time where clear communication and clear outlining of expectations is very, very important, and those discussions should be starting now. So just in terms of the immediate stuff, employees must continue to work from home if it's reasonably practical for them to do so under this 70% period that we're in now. And probably 1 December, although it wouldn't surprise me if that date was moved forward. Employers will have the discretion to be able to require employees to return to the office. So that is the first point for a long time that employers are going to have some semblance of control as to whether or not you can require your employees to return to the office or not. In Victoria, employees must also continue working from home. You're all very used to it, unfortunately, by now. And it's not until phase C, which has got that indicative date, which again wouldn't surprise me if that's for earlier, but it's 5th of November 2021, that employers are going to be able to return to the workplace if they are fully vaccinated. And I think we can all accept that Victoria is going to be harder than New South Wales has in relation to that. Just moving on to the next slide, checking the vaccination status of your employees. I probably don't need to talk too much about this, because obviously if vaccination is required, you're going to be required to collect evidence of the vaccination status of the employees. I'd just like to sort of make a brief note here about privacy considerations, because vaccination status is sensitive health information under the Privacy Act. So there are higher privacy protections that would apply compared to normal personal information that organizations might collect. So under the privacy principles, employers can only collect this health information, any health information about employees, if the employee consents and the collection is reasonably necessary to your functions or activities. I mean, in some respects, this is probably for most employers a moot point, because you collect sensitive information when you collect medical certificates or other information about people's medical conditions, as you would normally do with employees during the course of the employment. But Dr. Google has made people a bit sensitive about the collection of this information. So just maybe when you're asking people for it, assure them that you will deal with it as sensitive information, that it will be held securely, that you're not going to give it to anybody else. And I would suggest that, in the personnel file or something equivalently protected as the personnel file is the right place for that to go. Moving quickly on, having a plan for returning to the office, regardless of what that is, and clearly communicating that is absolutely going to be invaluable. As Bryony said, it's going to reduce anxiety because you know what the plan is. And we all want to reduce anxiety if we can for our employees, given everything that everybody has been through over the last 18 months. So aligning yourself to the roadmap, as people in retail have done, because hooray, we're finally open and people can come back to work, or having a more long-term plan. For example, at Workplace Law, we've sort of said we're actually okay working from home. We've been able to happily function, well, not happily, but we've been able to function effectively and productively from home during all of this period of time. And while we miss the human interaction with each other, and certainly sitting around and eating lots of cake together, that is okay for now, given that I think there's a little bit of concern about what's going to happen in the CBD and all of that sort of stuff. So we're going to start transitioning back to the office from the 1st of November, and that's been communicated to the team. We're probably going to go Team A, Team B, although my team is going to be called Team Drake. Lara, if you know Lara's team, is going to be called Team Harry Styles. So, we're just going to implement that as we roll along. But as usual, we need to be agile, and if there are changes, they'll be communicated. So with COVID safety plans, in addition to the benefit of training people in whatever your plan is going to be for your return to work strategy, or whatever time frame you decide that is going to be, New South Wales businesses must have COVID safety plans if you are in certain industries. And I would suggest that you should have one anyway, because it is a very sensible thing to have, because it's not like, COVID only affects certain industries. In Victoria, a COVID safe plan is mandatory for all businesses with on-site operations. So if you don't have one and you're thinking about returning to the office, you absolutely must have one. The other thing to talk about, I think, is access to premises for customers, clients and contractors, which is on the next slide. Because in addition to the people who are happily inhabiting your workplace, there are lots of other people who come and go. I mean, just using, again, workplace law as an example, we have people who deliver fruit, we have people who deliver stationery, we have people who come in to water our plants because, we're too hopeless to do it ourselves. We have clients, we have barristers, we have, people who just pop in for a coffee. So there's lots of people who come and go. So again, what is your plan? Because I assure you that your employees are going to want to know as to who is going to have access to your premises. So using New South Wales retail as an example, we know that at the moment you can only go in and browse if you are a fully vaccinated person, which has made it very awkward for people behind the counter who have to check vaccination status at the moment until the government gets its app together in terms of that being part of the check-in process. But what about after that? We know that 80% restrictions will be further lifted, and come 1 December anticipated date in New South Wales, there will be no difference between vaccinated and unvaccinated people. So if you are an organisation, and some of my clients who have, for example, event spaces, have contacted me to say, you know what, we want people who are coming in to use our event spaces or coming into our workplace where, they're going to be face-to-face with our employees. and I perceive that to be a risk, and they perceive it to be a risk, and I want them all to be fully vaccinated on the way in, you will need to have a plan. And these plans are wide and varied in their interesting natures, but if you want a process for ensuring that people who come into your workplace are fully vaccinated, then you will need to think about how you are going to check vaccination status if you're not in a jurisdiction where that's going to be part of the check-in requirement. How are you going to comply with capacity limits and social distancing requirements? And whether or not you decide that you're going to maintain disciplines like mask wearing, sanitizing, social distancing after those are no longer mandated. So this becomes a difficult, interesting discussion for employers as to what you want your workplace to look like after the government stops making the rules for you. And that is why a plan and a clear communication of a plan is absolutely going to be essential. I might just whiz through the checking vaccination status, complying with capacity limits and other service offerings, and maybe just talk about other service offerings. Everybody's used to click and collect and all of that sort of stuff now, which is a couple of slides on, because I know I've talked a lot and I'm sure there are lots of questions. So I might just talk about quickly, moving through the slides to the one that's titled Consequences of Breaches. The roadmaps, as you know, are currently implemented by way of public health orders. There are going to be fines for businesses who refuse or fail to comply with the health orders. I have said many times to many of my clients that it's disappointing that so much of this falls on employers to have to be the police, both with your employees and with people who are entering your premises, but it is what it is. And we're going to be the willow, not the oak, as we talked about earlier, and just do what we need to do to comply to get our business back up and running. So that's a very quick whiz through things that I wanted to talk about reopening. Alistair, happy to take questions, or if there's anything that's burning a hole in your pocket, happy to deal with it.
Look, I think what we'll do is we will take questions on notice for the minute. For those that are able to stay with us past 1:30, we might have an opportunity to ask a couple of those questions that I've been taking on notice. So for all those that are sending those through, thank you. I am keeping a register of them. But yeah, in the interest of time, meeting those to the 1:30 window, I might hand over to David for the minutes, and we can come back to yourself, Chris and David, at the end. But thank you, Athena, really insightful. I was actually going to see if Kyle might be able to run a quick poll, because I thought it'd be interesting to understand how many of us actually know our COVID safety plan as present with our employers. So Kyle, if you wanted to pop that up, that'd be wonderful. Thank you. Perfect. And we can just get people to submit that. We'll have an interesting little takeaway at the end there. Whilst we're doing that, I will introduce Dave Allan. So Dave, if you want to jump off, or David Allan, David, if you want to jump off mute for me, that'd be great. So Dave's joining us in the Workplace Risk Solutions capacity. So he's the director there at Willis Towers Watson. David has close to 15 years experience in the workplace risk industry, supported many of the world's largest organisations with their workers' compensation, work health safety programs by implementing strategies to protect their people and organisations. So David, I think maybe to help us understand workplace risk solutions and Willis Towers Watson being that quite broad, did you want to tell us a little bit about Willis Towers Watson and what it is that your team do there day to day, and then sort of step us into, what were you up to pre-life after lockdown and the main impacts of COVID?
Yeah, thanks, Alistair. I'll just double check you can hear me by nodding. Yeah, all good. So, thanks to everyone, and thanks for having me today. So, Willis Towers Watson, global organisation with over 45,000 employees. Locally, we've got around 600 throughout Australia, involved in all aspects of risk management, so risk transfer, so insurance and insurance broking, and also risk management services, so all consulting, etc. And the team I work in, you pointed out there, Alistair, is a workplace risk team which covers sort of two main streams, one being workers' compensation and one being work health and safety. So to your point about sort of the major sort of impacts that COVID's had on the workplace risk space, if I talk about the two areas of safety, I think from a safety perspective, one of the things I'd like to call out is probably within most organisations we've seen work health safety professionals, and Chris has probably been pivotal in Lendlease's response, really driving the response for organisations with regards to COVID-19. So a lot of them have become infectious disease specialists and specialists on protecting from infectious diseases. So yeah, work health safety teams have really led the way, I've seen, with most of our clients, which has been great. Also in the safety space, not sure if it's an impact, but it's come in through the time of COVID-19. We've seen industrial manslaughter provisions introduced and revised in some jurisdictions, so most notably probably Victoria and also the ACT. And to Chris's point, speaking before about sort of psychosocial health, we've seen the emergence and introduction of some guidance documents, I think, across the world with regards to how you're supposed to be managing psychosocial hazards in the workplace. I think the fact that mental health has become so much more important and how organisations are managing that within their own organisations. We've now seen Safe Works brought out the code of practice for managing psychosocial hazards, and we've also seen an international standard come out as well, so the ISO 45003. If we talk about impacts to workers' comp, though, I think we can look at financial positions of some of the different jurisdictions. Two biggest jurisdictions from a workers' comp perspective in Australia are New South Wales and Victoria. Victoria has been impacted significantly, obviously by lockdowns, as well as New South Wales. And their most recent report that's come out from WorkSafe has noted a $3 billion deficit to the Victorian workers' compensation scheme. And we're hearing that that's going to increase to around $4.5 million when the next annual report comes out. And if you look at New South Wales, they're running at around a $2 billion deficit. So there's been some significant impacts, not wholly related to COVID, but COVID's played a big part in those financial positions. And probably the other big impact to workers' comp, if I had to call out something else, is the reimagining and expansion of the definition of at work, which I think continues to evolve. Previously, it was quite black and white. With people, when you're in the office, you're at work, with some small discrepancies around that. But the definition of where you're at work has really changed, and as I say, will continue to evolve over time as well, Alistair.
Yeah, I know there's some fascinating case law around that. I've heard of some stories from New Zealand precedents that have been set with work from home, and things that really just kind of make you question how work is delivered and facilitated. To that point, I guess as we're moving into this new normal, what are you kind of hearing from your clients and the people that are working in direct connection to Willis? Like, how are they planning for the road ahead, and what kind of conversations are you having from a risk mitigation point of view?
Yeah, I think Athena covered off on some of these things with regards to returning to work and COVID-safe plans, etc. I think for those employers that need to be, we're working in the office, the physical traditional office is a necessity. We're seeing them go back to the office with COVID-safe plans, with mandates for vaccinations where it's appropriate. Rapid antigen testing. I know Recovery Partners, I see you guys are getting into that space as well. So I see that's a big sort of risk mitigation strategy. For those organisations where being in the traditional office isn't a necessity, and I think Chris touched on this as well, I think the hybrid working environment is really the way of the new normal. We talk about new normal, but it very much is. If I reflect on sort of what I'm hearing from organisations, they're not needing people to be in the office if they're literally responding to emails 5 days of the week. They can do that from home. So I think real estate strategies are being reviewed, and I think when leases come up, more and more people will be redesigning, whether they're downsizing satellite offices and stuff like that. So I think that's what's, from my point of view and what I'm seeing, people reimagining and redesigning their workplaces around that. So yeah.
Makes for an interesting prospect as to what does a CBD look like into the future. I'm sure that real estate will be occupied by individuals keen to be there. Mate, just as we're moving into this and we're starting to talk about return to work, through some of those transitions, you talked about workers and workers' comp. So what protections are in place for people as we head back into work, should we elect to do so and want to do so? And if there are people returning back into work and they've got various workers' comp protections, what then is there also for employers to consider in all of that?
Yeah, look, from an employee perspective, to put it simply, there's coverage for COVID-19 claims. So workers' comp policies will respond if someone has an exposure to COVID. And every case is assessed on its merit, of course. But I mean, in some states, I'll call out New South Wales here, there's been legislation written for some industries where it's presumed that you have contracted it at work if you are exposed to COVID and you come forward with a diagnosis. So if you look at healthcare, retail, aged care, etc., there's a presumption of acceptance and that you've contracted at work. But for industries not captured, the individual claims will be assessed on an individual merit. I think case law is going to be created as time goes on as well. I think if anyone's been looking at the newspaper, there's that landmark decision of the man who caught COVID whilst travelling for work. That was declined, now has been accepted, that man passed away, etc. And as time goes on, and as now we reopen and come out of lockdown with COVID, that's what we need to take into consideration as well. When we came out of lockdown last time, we were going on a strategy of eliminating COVID. This time we're coming out of lockdown with COVID and we're going to live with it. So it's going to be a very different sort of different situation. And I think case law is going to keep getting created with these different random scenarios that come up over time. In terms of employers, I think the impacts, Alistair, you asked about what sort of impacts will it have on employers. I think I saw some data come out of CIRA where they've looked at the number of claims that are coming in. This probably goes to Chris's point of since the most recent lockdown. There's been around 2,000 claims since the pandemic started in New South Wales, with 1,200 of them being since June 16, which is when the most recent Bondi cluster started in New South Wales, as an example. CIRA have released something estimating that there's going to be they estimated $638 million in costs in the next 12 months with opening up in terms of workers' compensation claims. So I think for employers, there's going to be ongoing pressures on pricing. We spoke about deficits for New South Wales and Victoria. These claims that come in, that $600 million that CIRA's forecasting for New South Wales alone, there's 7 other jurisdictions as well. That's going to need to be paid by somewhere. So I think there's going to be pressure on pricing and premiums. Or Alistair, you and I spoke about this the other day. There might be an introduction of some sort of levy that's brought in certain states. So in New South Wales, as an example, there's the dust disease levy that everyone pays every year as part of their premium. There could be a COVID levy or something that's brought in different states to cover the cost of these claims. Because as I say, we're opening with COVID and there's going to be an explosion of workers' compensation claims and cases once we do so.
Yeah, wow. I mean, I guess we can't have anything overly certain, and we will go with the willow approach, not the oak. But on that, I might invite Athena and Chris to also jump off mute. We might just look at 1 or 2 questions, if that's okay, guys. I know we're running a little bit past time. But I'm keen to get some of these discussions about, as things migrate and the health advice is changing quite rapidly. Where do we see ourselves as people start to challenge us? So if we're setting up a workplace and maybe our COVID safety plan says that, we're going to take certain responses. So one of the questions was around, if I do rapid antigen testing, would we be required to do that on an unvaccinated person if they had some sort of medical indemnity? And if I'm not doing that, am I seen to be negligent? Or is it that, I need to be steadfast in the plan until December 1 when the health advice becomes more liberal? I don't know who wants to start on that. It's a tricky question. Maybe Athena from a legal point, and then we'll go Chris and then Dave.
Thanks, Alistair, I think. Look, I think employers should apply the same old tried and tested work health safety measures that they have to every other risk in the workplace, to the risk of COVID exposure or transmission in the workplace. Like those, the risk assessment and, elimination, or if not possible to eliminate, what other measures can I put in place to best protect my workers strategy applies to COVID just the way that it applies to any other work health safety risk. So, I encourage employers, if you haven't done a risk assessment, please do one. I know that the Delightful Simon at Recovery Partners is helping out with those if you need assistance with it. But, you know, and, you know, maybe your risk assessment could be referred back to the 4 tiers that the Fair Work Ombudsman has put up on its website, you know, to guide employers as to whether or not it's going to be reasonable and lawful to require mandatory vaccination. So people who are out and about with citizens are at a higher risk than people who are, you know, sitting in an office and never going out other than to buy a coffee. And that's something that you have to take into account with all of this. There's no one size fits all approach that's going to work for employers, and employers who just try to throw a blanket over it and go, everybody do this all of the time, because are going to have some difficulties.
I think just to add to that, from our perspective, we put some policies in place in May last year, and it's amazing how they've actually stood the test of time. So the ones on social distancing and PPE and positive case and site shutdown and reopening, you know, it's almost like advances in testing and vaccination are kind of the 2 new factors. But the core of what you do as a workplace is fundamentally, we've kind of locked in these sort of 4 different standards for almost 12 months now. So it really is just this grappling with the testing and vaccination issue, because I think we're pretty sound on the basis of, you know, how we manage the risk of transmission.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add to that is, and it's sort of already been covered off by just having policies and things in place. So you're not just doing things, making it up as you go along. If you've got something in place that says how you're going to respond to any situation, I can see Athena and Chris nodding. That's going to give you greater protection by having a set process that you're following, rather than making it up every single time.
Yep. Okay. So fake it till you make it's not the way to go here. We want a plan. In terms of regarding liability, Dave, I might get you while you're still talking here. There's a question on liability and workers' comp. So if there is to be a view around site claims relating to people not wanting to work in the same room or office as unvaccinated people, and a lot of the questions have stemmed from that vaccinated versus unvaccinated, which pleasingly seems like it'll be a small percentage of the population, but there will be a percentage of the population nonetheless. Would the scheme feasibly accept these kinds of claims in principle?
Yeah, look, I think I'll start off by saying every claim will be assessed on its merit, but I think workers' comp, you've heard the word perception, and I think it's going to get tested very much. If someone perceives that they're going to be at greater risk of getting COVID and they submit a claim for that, I could see it potentially getting accepted, in all honesty. Like, I've seen crazy things get accepted because of perception. You and I, Alistair, could walk into a room and see the exact same thing and have different perception of it, and it impacts us differently. And my claim could get accepted if I had a diagnosis as a result of how I perceived it. So workers' comp is workers' comp. It's not employers' comp, and I would seriously say that you and employers will come up against things like that, and I wouldn't be surprised if claims did get accepted. But as I say, everything will be assessed on its merit, taking all the factual circumstances into account. I sound like Athena. I sound like a lawyer, don't I? But yeah.
There's a lot of it depends in that. Chris, having heard that, what's the Lendlease approach, if you might be able to sort of give us some sense of that vaccinated versus unvaccinated? How are you guys leading that out?
I guess a couple of things. So the risk-based approach is we've got a retirement living business and a retail business, and so, you know, there's sectors that we've said we're exposed to vulnerable people in the broader community, so we actually want to mandate vaccinations in those. And the rest we're kind of moving on. Some of them we're guided by clients in our particular markets. But it's interesting because, you know, because we're in so many different jurisdictions, even within the US, each state's a different jurisdiction. And if we look at the Australian lens of reasonably practical, it's reasonably practical that to provide a safe place of work, you would do everything to keep everybody safe. And so it's flipping the discussion away from the rights of those not vaccinated versus actually the rights to provide a safe place for those vaccinated. And so there's no silver bullet on the answer. Other than that is a lot of time and effort, and our legal costs are going into trying to work this out in a hurry.
Yeah. To that point, Athena, can we legally request or force employees to be vaccinated before coming into the workplace?
Well, that's $1 million question, Alistair.
Question.
As you know, I genuinely hate giving lawyer answers. I just can't stand it. It's part of my profession that irks me to tears. But it is actually going to depend on what the worker is doing, because the question is mandatory vaccination a reasonable and lawful direction? So if you've got a worker in childcare where the government has said, thou shalt vaccinate your workers, it is reasonable and lawful because the government requires it. So yes, in that instance, you can. If you've got the accounts payable clerk who sits in the corner in the office and doesn't really go out or see anybody, and the risk is therefore low, that is, the question as to whether it is reasonable and lawful in those circumstances to direct somebody to be vaccinated. And that is something that I'm absolutely 100% sure is going to be tested over and over again over the coming months as employers roll out blanket everybody get vaccinated policies and then seek to enforce them in the coming months with the if you're not vaccinated, I'm going to sack you position. So that whole question, and that's why I encourage people to get their risk assessment, because the risk assessment is largely going to dictate whether or not it is reasonable and lawful to ask people to be vaccinated to come back to work. With this whole everybody in my whole employee sphere, like Chris is talking about, there's unfortunately, I'm going to be encouraging more of a divide. In fact, not just blue collar and white collar, but even within white collar. If you've got business development managers, for example, whose job it is to get out onto the road, to go into other host locations where the host location may require the employees who attend there to be vaccinated, and all of those factors have to come into account. So it is complex. There's no one size fits all thing. Please take the time to consider all of this properly, because you're going to have different categories of employees where you've got different rules that are going to apply, and you need to deal with each of them sensitively.
Yeah, and I think we'll probably have to take a pause to the question and answer going forward. But I think the really nice takeaway to what all of you have said is really take everything in consideration. It's that willow versus oak. And Chris pointed this out actually at the very onset, where he talked about one of his best capabilities is he asks questions and he listens to the answers. So consultation is one of always the strongest points when it comes to work health safety leadership. It's asking questions, listening to what the people have their views around, and then starting to formulate a plan. So, Kyle, I'm interested to know, just as a bit of a takeoff before I hand back to Liz, did we get a result on that poll for COVID? Okay. All right, that's actually a lot higher than I thought. So 67% being comfortable that there's a plan in place and they're familiar, 23% somewhat, and 10% being no. So, yeah, that's really good. I'm glad that we're all feeling quite well informed. I'm sure that's going to ease some of our stresses. To the speakers, thank you very much, Athena, Chris, David. You guys have been super generous with your time and even going over for us. So thank you so much. Liz, I'll hand back to you to wrap us up.
Yeah, thank you so much to our speakers and equally to our audience, particularly the audience who are still here. I think there's still about half of the audience here. Thank you for asking some brilliant questions, and to our speakers for answering them. I think you provided more answers than our state governments have at times, so thank you. If you have any further questions for Recovery Partners or any of our speakers, please email myself at elizabeth@rrp.com.au on the screen just there. If there is something you are still unsure of, you can give Recovery Partners a call. We want you to feel better about tomorrow and make sure your work is as safe as possible. Recovery Partners have offices all over Australia and can help you and your business with a COVID safety management system, or conduct a gap analysis or a risk assessment, as Athena mentioned, to identify any issues. And we also offer rapid antigen testing. We invite you to follow Recovery Partners on LinkedIn to see our latest updates and blog articles, and of course, future events. Thank you so much, everyone. That was brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. That was fantastic.
Thanks, everyone.